Ladies and gentlemen, I am so thrilled to see you all again this semester. It is such a rare privilege to be able to speak to you about things that I find so fascinating, and it is amazing to me that so many other people enjoy these things too. You know, I can't talk about it at home because my wife and kids just know more history, please. But it's really great that you know, we have a learning community here, and I'm looking forward to an absolutely fantastic semester this year. As you can see from all the men who are coming in, tonight's a men's night. Thank God the college is really booming. We're having a tremendous semester. Our enrollment is really growing in a very significant way, and I hope that we can grow this program as well. It's great to see so many of you here on the first night, and halavai, we should run out of seats. The topic that we're going to look at this semester is one that I've avoided for a long time, primarily because I don't have a strong sort of like personal, cultural, historical affinity. As you can tell from my superior sense of fashion and my sense of humor, I'm a Litvak, I'm an Ashkenaz, so I don't know a lot about the Sephardi, but I have had so many requests from people to speak about Sephardic history that I really can't put it off any longer. I'm also a little bit intimidated because I have not studied the languages involved in great depth. My Spanish is pretty weak, and my Arabic is almost non-existent, but I'm going to challenge myself and push myself to be able to say something with some intelligence, I hope, this semester. Luckily, today is not so bad because we're going to be in the Roman period, so Greek and Latin are languages that I had the merit to study in my undergraduate days, so it's a little bit easier. But with that said, let's go straight into the material, and I'll give you an overview of what we've planned. So the topic is the Jews of Sfarad. Sfarad is a term we'll explore its etymology shortly, but basically it refers to the Iberian Peninsula, which is, for our purposes, basically Spain and Portugal. The Jews of Sfarad have a very distinct identity that is perhaps stronger than any other Jewish subgroup in our entire history. Maybe perhaps the Baghdadi Jews have a stronger sense of identity, but really the Sephardim have maintained their identity despite 500 years of exile from their homeland. So an exile within an exile, a Sephardic exile within a Jewish exile, it's really kind of an amazing thing. And so what we're going to do is, over the first half of this academic year, the fall, we'll look at the history of the Jews of this region up until the Great Expulsion of 1492 and the Portuguese events of 1497. And then in the spring, we'll continue with the Sephardic diaspora, which then gets more confusing because they intermingled with many of the populations of the East, the Mizrahi communities, and we'll tease that apart over the next few semesters. We are very grateful to our sponsors, the Jewish Pro-Life Foundation, who donated this lecture in memory of David and Dorothy Routman. And to let all of you know, but of course to let the internet audience know, which by the way has grown significantly. We hit the 1 million views mark a few months ago, and thank you. And we're encroaching on 10,000 subscribers. That number really sounds good, so I'm looking forward to hopefully hitting that number, and I'll share it with you. But the point of all of this, the reason why we do this, besides the fact that it's really fun to talk about Jewish history, is that we want to raise funds for our undergraduate students. It's all, well and good for us. We're all adults and we have some free time to spend studying these things, but we have to give our young people the wherewithal to be able to complete their degrees and achieve enough disposable income to be able to get away for a Monday night. So our scholarship has raised so far $7,096. I have a goal of $100,000. It's a little bit away, but don't worry, we have a few weeks to hit that goal. You can certainly donate online. Sponsorship of a lecture is $250. Your presence here is sufficient sponsorship for me. I'm very grateful to have a live audience, but if you would like to help out our students, that's really very worthwhile for all of us. Okay, so as I mentioned, the fall lecture series is going to be associated with the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, the Jews of Sfarad, from the earliest times, which is going to be our topic today, until the expulsion of 1492. Just to give you a sense of this period, We're going to concentrate especially on the Jews of the Muslim era. And by the way, I should also take note that tonight, of course, is the anniversary of the terrible attacks on this country of 9/11. We live in very heightened times of great tension between most of Western civilization and Islamic civilization. And, you know, we're so wrapped up in many of the political conflicts that are so brutal and so vital even today in the Middle East and even here in America that we lose sight of the larger historical picture. Ironically, as we'll discuss more towards the end of today's lecture, but certainly in coming lectures, we're going to be studying a period of remarkable friendship and amity between Jews and Muslims, a period of great coexistence that allowed the Jews to flourish in a Muslim environment in a way which really we only saw glimpses of this in ancient Babylon and perhaps in modern America. And so we'll explore that. We'll also explore the roots of the discord that would develop and eventually rise in great violence in the 19th century in particular, but that's going to be for the second semester. But we're going to concentrate on the Jews of Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, which goes from the conquest of 711 to the full expulsion of the Jews from Christian Spain in the 15th century. Just to give you a sense architecturally of the feel of this culture, this is the Gate of the Lions. It's a plaza inside the Alhambra Mosque, which is associated with one of the greatest Jewish figures of the period, Shmuel HaNagid, also known as Samuel ibn Nagrela, who was one of these remarkable figures, unique in Spain in many ways, who achieved excellence both as a secular individual, active in politics, active in the military. He was the commander of the armed forces, and at the same time a Talmid Chacham, a person who was regarded as a great Talmudic scholar as well. And he's associated with this particular Plaza of the Lions that shows some really beautiful Arabic-style architecture. Here's another view of the lions themselves. You can see that it's really quite a distinct and beautiful culture that has lasted. This dates back about 800 years. It just gives you a sense of the beauty and power of this unique Jewish Islamic civilization that we will be exploring. The plans for the spring, of course, are going to be quite different because then we'll be looking at the Sephardic Jews in exile as they were dispersed from the Iberian Peninsula throughout the Mediterranean basin into Central Asia in some cases, and then, of course, up into Northern Europe, places like Amsterdam where they had a huge impact, people like Spinoza and so on, and also out to the New World. We'll look at crypto Jews, we'll look at the Jews of New Mexico and all kinds of fascinating consequences of this 500 years ago event. So that's basically what we're planning to do for the entire academic year. Any questions or arguments at this point? Not yet. Good. I'm really excited, so let's get straight to the material. So why is there an exception for the Sephardim? Why is there an Iberian exception? I don't know. Hopefully by the end of this term we'll be able to determine some thoughts for ourselves. But let us understand what is unique about Sephardic Jewry. I would like to, at this initial moment, point out two very distinct things about Iberian Jewry that make them stand out in high distinction from Ashkenazic Jewry in particular. Shown here, of course, is a statue in Cordoba of the great eagle, Hanesher Hagadol, the Maimonides, who was one of these uniquely Sephardic figures who was elevated to a position of world fame for his philosophical thought. Also at the time, of course, he was a very famous physician serving to the royalty in Cairo at that time. But his roots were in Spain. He referred to himself as Has-Sephardi, the Sephardic one, because he was very proud, like many Jews for hundreds of years, of his Sephardic heritage, even though he was exiled as a result of a brief but powerful period of Islamic extremism. So he's an exceptional figure, but he's not exceptional within Spain. Why is that so? There are really a number of figures that are associated with this unique confluence of secular and religious authority and capacity that we find in Spain. We definitely find, I think, do I zoom in? Yes. Here, this is, for example, the Spanish government, even though they had expelled the Jews, they're still proud of the Rambam. They still put him on their stamps like this to indicate that, you know, there's this unusual aspect of Sephardi Jewry that they're able to excel in both of these areas. They're able to find a unique balance between the secular and the religious that is a very hard balance to strike anywhere else. In Ashkenazic lands, you do find Jews who excel in the secular, particularly when you get to the early modern period, the Enlightenment. Then you find an explosion of Jews who are very prominent in the sciences, in all the humanities, the arts, and so on. But you don't find those people, those Einsteins as it were, also being Roshei Yeshiva. You don't see them leading major congregations, writing works of religious significance, and so on. But you do find that in Spain. That's a very special thing, and we'll look at many of these figures, such as the Rambam, Shmuel ibn Agrela, Yehuda Halevi. We can go on, looking at these figures who excelled in both. And it's also interesting and not so well known that sometimes their exploration of secular culture was quite surprising by religious standards. For example, the aforementioned Shmuel ibn Agrela, one of the things, by the way, in Islamic Spain, poetry was something that was valued of tremendous status. Like today, we tend to value movie stars, right? Matt Damon, Ich Will Smith. I mentioned Will Smith because a lot of my undergraduates say I have a striking resemblance to. But there's a, you know, we respect these people as creators of high culture. In Spain, it was all about poetry. And the poetry was culturally part of the mainstream to a degree that it's hard for us to even imagine it. They would have poetry slams. They would have parties where they get together and they would challenge poems where they would, like, you know, see who could make up the best poem on the spot. They would commission poems that would be written and recorded and retold for, you know, the benefit of the masses. And Jews were deep into this poetry, Arabic language poetry, which they innovated using Hebrew meter and rhyme, and vice versa. Hebrew poetry was also, you know, significantly advanced by its encounter with the Arabic. And sometimes the subject of those poems, to finish my point, extended into areas that you would be very surprised with. Like, for example, here's Shmuel ibn Agrela, who's writing commentaries in the Talmud, and at the same time he's writing drinking poems and writing love poems. Now, this doesn't happen in Lakewood. I mean, you don't have the Rosh Yeshiva writing love poetry, right? So it's a very, very distinct kind of feature that is not at all unique in Sephardic history. It happens over and over again, where that's considered the mark of excellence, to be able to demonstrate, you know, being a leader in both the secular and in the religious world. Secondly, and perhaps related to that, what is the contrast between Sephardim and the other major ethnic group in the Jewish world, the Ashkenazim, is the degree of insularity as a value. We could look at different points in Jewish history to try to find the origins of this distinction, but for sure there's a vector for Ashkenazic Jews that looks inward, whereas for Sephardic Jews it looks outward. And perhaps the key date would be 1096, the horrendous Rhineland massacres associated with the First Crusade. In those massacres, which occurred in northern Germany, the heartland of what is Ashkenaz, Jews chose, under duress, quite often to commit suicide and even kill their own families, their own children, rather than submit to baptism. And this was kind of like a turning point, as many scholars have identified, Robert Chazen first among them, as, you know, this is a cultural marker for Ashkenazi Jewry, that when stressed, we will go to the max, even to the point of giving up our lives. horrible chronicles from that period continue to be remembered in synagogues today. We read the Av HaRachamim prayer every Saturday, which memorializes those martyrs of the 1096 massacres. So Ashkenazic Jewry, certainly from 1096, but one could arguably say earlier, begin to look at the outside world as fundamentally toxic, as dangerous, and that all things of value must be inward focused, and that Ashkenazic culture begins to fold within itself, writing commentaries upon commentaries, so that we look sort of like as an inward turning helix of some kind. That's a bad metaphor, but maybe I'll edit it out of the internet version. Sephardim don't do that. Sephardim, on the other hand, when pressured, and their pressure was to an extreme degree, they begin to find ways of accommodating that pressure. They say, rather than giving up our life, we will find ways of persevering in hiding. And of course, the greatest example of this is the Inquisition, which ultimately, found its endpoint in the expulsion. This is a picture of a Jew in the Inquisition being forced through a ritual of humiliation, wearing the San Benito and the large dunce's cap, which was a hat worn to humiliate people who were accused of Judaizing. We'll obviously have more time to speak about this towards the end of the term. But for Sephardic Jews, the idea was when we're pressured like this, to commit suicide would be a complete denial of all of our values. We must find ways to cope with the threat by becoming crypto-Jews, by hiding what we need to, by maintaining perseverance for generations upon generations, a tremendous level of spiritual heroism in its own right, but that's a strategy of coping with the outside threat. And that's a way of mimicking the outside world, of disguising one's true identity in order to adapt to the threat, whereas for the Ashkenazi Jews it would be martyrdom or nothing. So a very different kind of direction that Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews took. So there's just a couple of ideas behind the Iberian exception. What I'd like to do over the course of this class is, I forgot one more detail. Sorry. Another difference that is extremely important to remember when we're talking about Sephardic Jewry is the fact that for most of its history, Sephardic Jewry was on the periphery of the Jewish world. And there are a lot of things that you can do when you live on the periphery that you can't do if you live in the center. So what is the center? Obviously, in the ancient period, the center would be in biblical Israel. But shortly after the exile of the first century, the main center shifts over here to the region between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, here in what would be lower Iraq and Kuwait. That's where the great Talmud academies are, Sura, a little bit higher up, Pumbedisa. That's really the main axis around which the Jewish world moves intellectually. Other major centers, of course, would be in Alexandria, later in Cairo, a developing center in Greece and in North Africa, but primarily the center of the Jewish world is over here and even further to the east. Spain is way out here at the other end of the Mediterranean. It's a long sea voyage, an even longer and harder overland voyage. And so Spain, even though it's quite an ancient community, as we shall see today, it nevertheless is very far away from the center. And as a result, the method of adaptation to threats, to opportunities, it can be quite different from what happens in the center. One of the telling stories of the 12th century in particular is Spain's intellectual self-emancipation from the rest of world Jewry, as Spain finds its own voice and its own unique way to identify its Jewish heritage, and begins to express this in the so-called golden age of Yehuda Halevi and others. So we'll explore that later on in the term, but it's very important to remember that for most of its history, Spain was in the periphery, far away from all of the activity in the rest of the Jewish world. Jews evince a remarkable degree of consistency. The legal code is it's hard to say universally maintained, but nevertheless universally respected throughout the entire Mediterranean basin. But if you have a shaila, if you have a question, and this is a few years before email was invented, you have to send a message. When there's no official postal service, you have to essentially leapfrog it from one Jewish village to another, and you have to wait years till the message gets to the academies in Babylon and then gets back to you in Spain. So it made sense that Spain would slowly develop its own intellectual tradition. Yeah. Okay, so what are the major periods that we're going to explore? Here's our historiography. We're going to look at the ancient period, that's the earliest settlement, which is your question exactly, up until the Muslim conquest of 711. Which is a date which has been enshrined in American culture. You probably didn't know this, but all of those fast food places, one across the corner there, named after the Muslim conquest of Spain. And who knew? So that's going to be today's lecture, and next week's lecture will be focused on those two periods. Then we're going to look at the Muslim period, which goes from the early 8th century to a period called the Reconquista, which is broadly defined as several centuries worth of Christian reconquest, hence Reconquista, of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. And it takes place over a series of centuries as they're slowly driven to the south. And then we're going to look at the Christian period. We're looking at the Jews primarily in northern Spain from the 13th century, when the Reconquista really gets moving, until the expulsion of 1492. That's our periodization for the semester. Okay. Oh my gosh, now we'll get to the real history here, the earliest settlement. Okay, when did these Jews get there? So, this entire class is almost completely based on the work of this scholar, Solomon Katz, a native of Buffalo, born in 1909, a war hero. He won the Bronze Star for his service in World War II. And he was, for most of his life, a scholar at the University of Washington. I read for this class, reread actually, a book he wrote in his early 20s, which was all about the Jews of Visigoth and Gaul. And I have to say, I nearly cried at some passages. That shows you how strange I am, that I would nearly cry reading. It was so good. It was so amazing. It was written, 80 years ago, and it was so brilliant. And it showed me what we call in Hebrew, Yerida Hadoros, the decline of the generations. Because he wrote this thing in his 20s, back in the 1930s, and it was no problem to write a scholarly monograph and just, quote passages in French, German, Greek, Latin, whatever, and not translate them. Because you figured everybody who's reading these knows these languages. You can't get away with that anymore. Scholars must translate into a major language like English or something like that. So it was really a pleasure to read a work of great scholarship from an era when this kind of polyglot scholarship, and he's American-born too, but this polyglot scholarship was valued. At any rate, it was a brilliant book, and almost all the research that I'm going to talk about today comes from that book. First of all, when did the Jews come to Spain? So we have a series of fascinating legendary origins, meaning that Spanish Jews like to say these things, but we have no real good historical basis to validate them. Here's one. It comes from the book of Ovadia, the biblical book of Ovadia, where there is this passage here that refers to Ad Sarfat, which normally would translate as until France, the Galut Yerushalayim, and the exiles of Jerusalem, meaning those Jews who were exiled from Jerusalem, Asher Bisfarad, who are in Sfarad. Like, wow, that's it. It's all over, right? There's a reference right there in the Bible about the Jews being exiled from Jerusalem. You can place this because we know the author of the book of Ovadia. We're talking about the first temple. We're talking about 6th century BCE, being exiled from Jerusalem to Spain. My gosh, that is an amazingly early source. What's the problem with this source? Very good. Who says that Sfarad refers to Spain, right? That's the word we use now for Spain, but who says that's what the biblical book of Obadiah refers to. There are lots of words that can change meaning over time, and as Jews began to explore Europe, they applied words, place names from the Bible to various places for who knows what reason. There's no reason to say specifically that the Sfarad referred to here refers to the land we call Spain. So we know that the Jews, from Obadiah, we do know that the Jews who were exiled from Jerusalem went to a place called Sfarad, but that could be, I don't know, the island of Cyprus. It could be Boca Raton. We don't know. It just says Sfarad. So the problem is etymological. Who says that Sfarad refers to Spain? Hang on a second. I'm going to show you one more example. Here's an example from the Talmud, the same kind of problem. This is Tractate Yevamot, which is a little better. It says here, Afilu sfinot, even boats, habaot megalia, that come from a place called Galia, le-Aspamia, to a place called Aspamia. So Aspamia sounds even better because there is a place name that sounds much better called Hispania, which would be Spain. And we'd like to say that Aspamia is Spain. But as Dr. Katz demonstrates with absolute clarity in his book, he can find about 8 different place names that are very similar and actually are more logical, closer, more closely related geographically. So there's no real way to tie either of these kinds of places to Spain. They may be etymologically related, but not necessarily historically. Please. So we don't have good connections, but here's one fun one, by the way. The Spanish term don, which means like Lord, sounds a lot like the Hebrew term Adon, which also means like Lord or Sir. So you have these kind of fanciful things, which is interesting, but no real proof. Let's go to something a little more serious. In the 16th century, an early Jewish historian named Moshe ibn Shem Tov ibn Habib claimed to have seen an inscription, meaning like a gravestone, written in Hebrew that had the text that read in English, "This is the grave of Adoniram, servant of King Solomon, who came to collect taxes and died here." Now, that would be an amazing inscription that would really help us date a Jewish community in Spain to the reign of King Solomon, because if he is collecting taxes in Spain, and so much so that we have this rather unusual name, Adoniram, who is actually acting as an envoy, it sounds like it's a really good proof. And in fact, Moshe ben Shem Tov believed this inscription, and he wrote about it. The problem is we've lost the inscription, and there are a lot of doubts about the veracity of this account. So it's hard to rely on this sort of statement. Without the inscription existing and without modern standards of evaluating evidence, we just don't know if we can rely on it. It is a suggestion, though, of an origin of Spanish Jewry that goes back perhaps 3,000 years. Rather dramatic. Finally, this is our scientifically best and earliest example of the Jewish settlement of Spain, and it goes back to a little baby girl in the village of Adra, where an inscription was found in Latin that read, that was discovered in the 18th century, and that's already in the Age of Enlightenment. We have a lot more confidence in the scholarship that happened then, and a transcription from the Latin text was made by a scholar named Juan de Mariana, and the text read as follows. And here you can see it's somewhat, it's broken up, and we don't have all of the letters intact. We have a blank couple of lines, then we have the phrase Nia, and then there's a little sort of an asterisk, it's actually a circle. Salomonula, the M-O is wiped out, but it makes sense from context. It would be of Solomon. An una mens quattro di una Judea, which translates from Latin, here lies, we assume is what it's written there because of the gravestone, some little girl named something ending in Nia, daughter of Solomon, aged 1 year, 4 months and a day, a Jewess. And this particular inscription, although the inscription itself is lost, the source is fairly reliable, it dates back to the 2nd century of the Common Era. So the 100s. We know for sure that there was at least one Jewish girl, daughter of Solomon, who died at a terribly young age and was buried in Spain. Her name might have been Junia, maybe Anya, Licinia, something like that, but this is our earliest example, a reliable scholarly example of Jewish settlement, and it dates back to the 2nd century. Quite old. Okay, but there's more. It gets so cool. Now here's the problem. As I mentioned earlier, we have a tremendous paucity of Jewish records, and our source base is quite biased. This is partially due to the fact that Spain is, once again, the periphery, right? There was like no Chinese restaurants anywhere in the entire peninsula, so who moved out there? You only had these scattered settlements. Almost everything we know about Spanish Jewry comes from church records, and we'll look at some of them. So here's a fascinating passage from the book of Romans in the New Testament. That's, if you're not familiar with it, if you go to a hotel room, you open up the drawer in the bedstand, you find a book there, you flip, you see it looks like a Tanakh, and then there's something added at the end. That's what that is. So St. Paul, who was famous for traveling throughout the Mediterranean basin and winning converts to Christianity, he has a letter that he writes from Corinth, which is in the Peloponnesus in Greece. He writes a letter to the Jewish Christian community of Rome, Jewish-Christian, because in Rome, in Paul's day, there was not a clear distinction between who was Jewish and who was Christian. There were Christians who were born as Jews and continued to observe the Sabbath and Kashrut and things like that, and there were Christians who were born as Gentiles who adopted more of these early Jewish Christian practices, and it was something that would only really be teased out over the next few decades. At any rate, he writes to them. He says, look, I'm sorry I haven't come visited in a long time, and I really, really want to come, and I will do it whenever I journey to Spain. And he clearly says Spain using language that was common for that time. And at the end, he also says, therefore, when I have performed this and have sealed to them this fruit, meaning I have talked to them about the value of Christianity, I shall go by way of you to Spain. So let's think about this for a second. What does this say about the possibility of a Jewish community in Spain? It doesn't mention Jews in Spain. Okay, so we know there were definitely enough Jews there that we saw that young girl's inscription, but why would he be going to Spain in the first place? To convert Jews to Christianity. That was his big deal. That's much of what he did. He also converted pagans, but he definitely, it's more likely for him to find an audience in places where there is a Jewish community. So it's an indication, perhaps, of him, Jews living there. Here's a map that shows where he was in the Peloponnesus, Rome, of course, up here, and Spain all the way out here. So he's clearly making like this grand tour of the Mediterranean, going around from place to place, hopping from Jewish community one to the other, often arguing with Jews, trying to convince them to convert to Christianity. And Spain, of course, was on his list because Spain had that community. It's a kind of like a sideways argument, but it is rather convincing, I think. When we look at the Synod of Elvira, this is an early church gathering in Spain, about the year 305. It actually happened very close to this ancient structure, so we actually have a picture of imagining what it must have looked like. We have 3 church rules that were imposed that clearly refer to Jews, and they say something about the community. But when we look at these 3 sources, you'll see that it's kind of hard to imagine what the community was like when looked through the hostile lens of the church. But let's have a look at those 3 rules. So here's the first one. Canon 16 reads, Catholic girls may not marry Jews or heretics, incidentally, etc. So there must have been some kind of problem of Catholics marrying Jews. We can understand that. By the way, the distinction between Jews and heretics goes back and forth through much of this period. Sometimes they're considered one category, sometimes 2 categories. But okay, we can understand this, and this can be kind of like a statement of faith, right? Even if there are no Jews there, you could still say, like in Japan, they sometimes have anti-Semitism. There are hardly any Jews in Japan, but you can still be anti-Semitic, for was nicht. as they say in Japanese. Here's another one, though. Look at this. If any cleric or layperson, meaning like not an official functionary of the church, eats with Jews, he or she shall be kept from communion as a way of correction. So what do you make of this? What would this say about the Jewish community of Spain? That's a very good point. I think what it basically means is that, yeah, Christians are eating with Jews, and clerics, priests, are eating with Jews, that they're getting along well enough that they can have brunch together. And the church is saying, look, we got to stop this, because who knows, one thing leads to another. Eventually there's mixed dancing, who knows? So this indicates that the Jewish community was at least significant enough that they are eating with clerics. Now here's my favorite. Check out this next one. This is great. Okay, landlords are not to allow Jews to bless the crops they have received from God and for which they have offered thanks. Such an action would make our blessing invalid and meaningless, right? This is the church writing this canon. Anyone who continues this practice is to be expelled completely from the church. So it's a kind of a harsh punishment, yeah, no allowing Jews to bless your crops. But what does it say about the Jewish community? What does it mean? What does it imply?
They were very strong, that they were significant.
That they were strong in what sense? I mean, if you had like Christian peasants, and, you know, it's the beginning of the planting season. They say, oh, look at that. We're planting now. We better do everything right. You know, and whatever, what's a typical Spanish name? Maria says to Juan, Juan, you better get out there and find a Jew to bless our crops, because we want to make sure everything grows right. It speaks to a great integration of the Jews and the Christians, to the degree that the Christians will rely on the spiritual activities of the Jews. And they don't see it as a contradiction. They don't see it as a problem. The church has to spell this out and say, listen, if you're getting one religion at a time, you can't get blessings from the Jews and get blessings from us. I'm sorry. It's not like you double up the blessings. You choose one or the other. That's it. So this is a remarkable kind of document that, even though it's written from the perspective of the church, and it doesn't say directly how large the community is, how widespread it is, how powerful it is, it does give indications that there must have been something significant if they would find it necessary to rule this way. Okay. Now, that's up until the 3rd century, our earliest settlement. Now we get to the terrible Visigothic period. And this is a period, I have to say, that, you know, I mentioned that I read Cats and I cried. I actually cried for 2 different reasons. Sometimes I cried because I saw, you know, how scholarship had changed so much in 100-odd years. But I also cried sometimes because this is a very, very sad period of Spanish-Jewish relations. And in fact, we shall see that one of the reasons for the beginning of the rapprochement between Jews and Muslims was primarily because of the absolutely incredible persecution that the Jews suffered under the Visigoths in the 7th century, as we shall see. So what exactly is the Visigothic Empire? Spain at this point was part of the Roman Empire. But Rome was falling apart. You'll recall that Rome is sacked in the year 405 by the Vandals, and they spray painted all over the Colosseum and things like that. That was a joke. Hardly anyone laughed. Thank you, Ms. Rottenberg, for laughing. But there are also other groups related to the Vandals, such as the Ostrogoths. Those are the Eastern Goths, and the Visigoths were known as the Western Goths. The Visigothic Empire was related to the Roman Empire, related to its downfall, and based primarily in Spain and in Gaul, as you can see here. And in 476, this is probably the high point of the Visigothic Empire, and they go through some of their own changes which have a dramatic impact on Jews. It's important to recognize, however, that although they were Christians, the Visigoths were originally not Catholics. They were Arians, spelled with an I, not related at all to like the Aryan nations. It's not a Nazi concept. It goes back to a bishop named Arius. The Bishop Arius from North Africa argued a different relationship between God and Jesus than the Catholics did. The Catholics wanted to maintain that they were somehow united in a Trinity together with the Holy Ghost. I have no idea what this actually means, but the Catholic doctrine was very much wrapped into the identity, meaning the unity of these things, whereas the Arians wanted to say, no, there was clearly a hierarchy. There was God the Father and Jesus the Son, and this made a big difference to them. So while they were Arians, the Jews were actually fairly well treated. It was considered a heresy by the Catholics, and in 325 at the Council of Nicaea, Arianism was officially decried as a heresy by the Catholic Church. But Jews did fairly well under the Visigoths. We have no instances of any specifically anti-Jewish legislation recorded by the Visigoths, who basically maintained Roman law. So to the degree to which Roman law has some anti-Jewish discrimination, and that will be a larger discussion than we have time for here, but the Visigoths essentially just kept the same legislation. So Jews would not have been treated differently in Spain than they would have been treated, let's say, in the Italian peninsula, because they were under the same body of law. But things change dramatically when the Arians decide to abandon their heresy and become Catholics. And that happens in the year 589 when Recared I, shown here in this 19th century painting, decides to convert to Catholicism. And at this point, the Jews of Spain go through 122 years of incredible, increasing persecution to a mind-boggling extent that makes it much more understandable why the Jews would look to the Muslims as their deliverers from the newly Catholic regime. To be sure, the phenomenon known as the zeal of the convert is at play here, that because the Visigothic kings had for several hundred years flouted the Catholic Church and maintained a heretical movement, when they decided to return to the fold, they wanted to demonstrate literally their bona fides, their good faith, by showing just how Catholic they were. And in their interpretation, the way to do that would be to really persecute the Jews badly. And this is in fact what they did. Through a period of increasing legislation against the Jews, it's hard to even imagine how it was actually implemented. But implemented it was. Montesquieu, the French philosopher, wrote, and his insight is brilliant here. He says, tous les maximes, tous les principes, tous les vues de l'Inquisition, that all of the maxims, all of the perspectives, everything was similar to the Inquisition itself. I said that in French because I really liked how Samuel Katz did everything in different languages and stuff like that. But basically, you can read that because it's almost totally English, right? But essentially, it's true, you know. And in fact, if we jump much further in history, the great Holocaust historian Raoul Hilberg traced the development of Nazi ideology to the Spanish Inquisition, which can really be brought back to the Visigothic period after the conversion of Recared I. The period that we're going to look at now extends from 589 with Recared's conversion to 711, and it is just incredibly hard to imagine how this actually happened. Again, we do not have any Jewish sources to describe how Jews managed these draconian laws. We only have the laws themselves. And there are certain standards that we can use to evaluate law statutes for historical information. For example, if you see, I think if we were to go back over 500 years in time and look back at this period and say, wow, look how often America had to pass drug-related legislation. Look how many times they had to reiterate extreme jail sentences for people who abuse drugs. What would you say about the legislation? If you didn't know anything else, didn't read any newspapers, didn't get any social history, all you had was the laws on the books, what would you say about drug use in America? That it was exploding, right? That they had to keep reiterating these laws because people were flouting them. So we see from the laws some sense of how society must have existed. In the case of the Well, we'll see. So let's look at some of these. First of all, Recared, against the wishes of many churchmen, forcibly baptized the Jews to Christianity. Now, many churchmen, Gregory the Great among them, for example, indicated that it was against church law to forcibly convert Jews to Christianity. And in fact, it defeated the whole purpose of the existence of the Jewish people in Christian thought. Under a bull known as Sicut Judaeus, which means given that the Jews live, the idea in medieval Christianity was that the Jews were to be preserved in a subordinate state in order that when Jesus came in a second coming, then Jews could recognize Mashiach, recognize him as Messiah, and that would validate what Christians had believed all along. If all the Jews were to be killed, God forbid, then there would be no one around to validate that, to act as a witness. It was also known as the doctrine of witness because the whole point of allowing the Jews to live was to preserve them from a later period. That's just a theological argument. There are, of course, social and economic and other arguments. But basically, for most of Christian history in Europe, Jews were tolerated as a lower class population, persecuted from time to time, but never the subject of genocide and rarely the subject of mass forced conversions because it contradicted church law. There's a lot to say about this, but we don't have a lot of time. Recared, however, broke from this and he insisted on forced baptisms of Jews. Originally, he only insisted on the children of mixed marriages, which also shows that there were mixed marriages, probably involving women converting to Judaism. But later he extended it even, under his successor Sisebut, it was actually extended to all Jews, that all Jews were forcibly converted. We know that many Jews fled to nearby Gaul, which would be in the region of what we would today say France. Others, though, decided to, like we'll see with the Inquisition, decided to convert because they hoped that this would pass and then they would be able to practice their Judaism secretly. If it was just a conversion in name only, how serious could it be? So you see already the presaging of some of the patterns of response to threat that we see later in Spain. But once and this again sounds like the Inquisition, once the Jews were baptized, they were not trusted to be real Christians. Receswinthe, and by the way, one thing I do like about the Visigoths, the kings have really cool names. I will give you a few really cool names. I have to like that about them. But Receswinthe, he instituted oaths that, for example, if a baptized Jew, who technically should be a full Christian, is called to court, no, he had to take an extra oath because he could not be trusted as a true Christian. But they did have leniencies because these newly Christian former Jews did not enjoy eating pork, so they actually had laws in the books saying that these newly Christians don't have to eat pork because they don't enjoy it. But the fact that they have to say that they don't have to eat pork means that there must have been a significant number of them. Punishment for a series of crimes, such as being caught lighting candles for the Sabbath, or not working the fields on Saturdays, or things like that, arranged. There was lashes. Typically, the number would be 100 lashes. Confiscation of property, exile, and then this mysterious term, decalvatio, which scholars debate what this exactly means. The literal translation of the Latin means to make bald. So some theorists think that it must mean scalping, as this individual from the 19th century was scalped, which was practiced in North Africa, not by the Visigoths, but by the Berbers. But scalping in North Africa was not called decalvatio, and it was quite often fatal. Whereas in Visigothic Spain, people who suffered decalvatio tended to survive, so it might have referred to shaving the head as a kind of a humiliation, or perhaps pulling the hair out of the head. We're not sure. It's certainly not a nice punishment. And it was meted out several times to the same individuals. So it could have been merely shaving, or it could have been something much more violent. Punishment for conversion to Judaism, however, is pretty stiff and terrifying. Typically, conversion to Judaism happens in the relationship with marriage, and the punishment for such a conversion for males, to use the term that Solomon Katz refers to, would be amputation of the virile member, and for females, it would be amputation of the nose. So very horrific kind of punishments that were imposed to try to stop mixed marriages. And then there are a whole series of bizarre laws that are passed talking about forbidding the observance of Shabbat that required Jews, again, who are technically Christians now because they have been forcibly baptized, but these new Christians had to report to a priest prior to the onset of the Sabbath, and then during the Sabbath to make sure that they were violating the Sabbath. And when there were holidays like Pesach or Sukkot, if you wanted to leave town, the laws actually stated that you had to report to priests along the path to your destination, like you were on parole, and make sure that you were in fact not observing the holiday. Now you try to think about this, it's mind-boggling. Was it actually enforced? It's hard to imagine that it would be, but one indication of the reality of it is other laws that specify punishments for Christian accomplices, meaning priests who are lenient with Jews, who do not want to work the fields on Sabbath, and others who accept bribes in order for the Jews to be removed from these various punishments. These kinds of laws, like the drug laws we talked about earlier, indicate that there was a significant sized Jewish community, that they were technically Christian, but secretly flouting a lot of these laws through the payment of bribes. Again, it's hard to read Jewish history through these kinds of documents, but you get a sense of how horrible it must have been to try to live a Jewish lifestyle under this kind of legislative environment, where there was so much corruption, and that just to do the simplest Jewish thing, you had to pay a bribe or suffer potentially horrific punishments. So that's this awful period from 589 to 782. 589 to 711. And that's the point when Jews call out to Muslims south of the Iberian Peninsula in North Africa and actively assist in their conquest of Spain. That'll be the topic for us next week, but before we go there, let's just look at the few little bits of information we can get about their culture and their economy from the tiny amount of scattered sources we have from this period. I mentioned already the weakness of the sources, that almost everything we have comes from non-Jewish sources talking about the Jews. But we do have a few inscriptions and a few other pieces of data that give us a sense of what the internal Jewish life was like. We know that their language was originally Hebrew, indicating also quite an ancient civilization. We know because, for example, the Christians report that there was I'll have to show you in a second, that when certain churchmen died, the Jews liked them so much that they attended their funerals and honored the churchmen by chanting psalms, Tehillim, in Hebrew. So at least they had literacy enough to read Hebrew. There are a few examples of this nature. We also see in the earliest inscriptions trilingualism. So this is a Tortosa gravestone. As badly damaged, it was used for a long time as a paving stone, as many of these early stones were. And you can see at the very top there is a Hebrew inscription, which doesn't say a lot of tremendous information for us, but it fits with a lot of traditional Hebraic forms that are associated with funerals. Then it continues in Latin and finally in Greek. A few interesting things like the five-pointed candelabrum you can see over here, which is actually a very traditional Jewish symbol in a lot of ancient inscriptions, not the nine-pointed candelabrum of Hanukkah and not the six-pointed candelabra of the temple, but a five-pointed one, perhaps to distinguish that it's not trying to reproduce the temple, but the idea of a menorah is a very ancient Jewish symbol. I mentioned already at the funeral of Hilary of Arles that the Jews sang psalms there. Under Erwig, again, these cool Visigothian names, he demands 100 lashes for any child over the age of 10 who studies Torah. So the punishment, of course, is draconian, but it also tells us that there must have been children who were studying Torah. And you know, you think this is actually, I'm going to use this on my kids when they don't want to get out of bed in the morning. Say, do you know what the Jews of Visigothic Spain had to go through? It gets to a fever pitch where it's hard to even imagine that this legislation was actually implemented. That under Egica, one of the last of the Visigothic kings, Jews are at first forbidden to engage in trade locally, and then with any Christian, and then finally even internationally. That the Jews are not, I mean, how are they supposed to make a living if they can't do business with anyone, literally? So it was completely intolerable. We will say next week, I'll talk about what few sources we do have about the trade that they engaged in at that time. Laws banned agricultural work on Sundays, which culminated in the confiscation of lands, also indicate, by the way, that Jews were agrarian, that Jews must have been farming at this time, which is not typical for much of the period. Okay. The Jews were finally, not surprisingly, accused of treason at this time. This is a statue of King Wamba. Wamba. And apparently this is not a very accurate depiction, because Wamba, according to Katz, is probably not his real name, but it was a diminutive. Wamba means pot-bellied, and he looks pretty buff here in this 18th century statue. But under King Wamba, Hilderic from Nimes to the north tried to mount a rebellion against Wamba and the Visigoths, and Jews, when they heard about this, they fled there hoping to join his side. Unfortunately, the rebellion was unsuccessful, and the Jewish plan to overthrow Wamba was foiled. In 693, another similar rebellion was put down. Once again, Jews now looked to the south, trying to get Muslims to join them in overthrowing the Visigoths, once again put down. It was only in 711 that we finally have the Muslims coming across the Straits of Gibraltar into the region, where they were welcomed by Jews, and it was the Jewish participation in that conquest of Spain is something that we will spend our time on next week. But once again, ironically, on, of all days, 9/11, when we explore a period when the Muslims actually came to the rescue of the Jews, and the Jews lived for 500 years in relative stability with them in Spain, gives you just a sense of the scope of Jewish history, and that we should try to understand things within this larger culture. I thank you very much for your attention and your endurance, and I look forward to a fantastic semester with you. Hello everyone, I hope you enjoyed that lecture. I myself had a fantastic time preparing the research for it, and it was great to see so many of you in the live audience again after the hiatus of the summer. And for all of you out in internet land, I hope you found that a very satisfying intellectual experience. It's an important time of year right now. I'm recording this in September of 2017, just before Rosh Hashanah, the new year, and it occurred to me that I should probably stick some kind of call to action on the end of this video, because we're living in very difficult times, and my small contribution, which I'd like you to share in, is to trying to spread a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more awareness of the fascinating aspects of Jewish history that made such a huge contribution to world culture. And I hope they're useful for you and useful for your friends. So here's 3 quick ideas how you can take this to the next level. The first is, don't keep this video to yourself. I mean, I assume you're watching it on some kind of social media, so please hit that share button. And more than that, why don't you just write a little, blurb at the top that says something like, "This guy is such a jerk, but I love his ties," or something like that. But say something, share it with your friends, and let them see it. Maybe it'll help spread goodness in the world, or at least knowledge. Second, if you are in the greater New York, New Jersey area, why don't you come on down and visit us and attend the live audience. The lectures are free, open to the public, and love to have you in the audience. You can ask some really hard questions. I may not answer them, but I'll probably edit them out of the internet version. And third, this is perhaps most important, why don't you consider supporting our undergraduate students? A big part of the reason why we give these lectures is because we want to try and promote the study of Jewish history here at Touro College, and we need your help. So please click on the link that's provided and consider donating to our scholarship fund so we can make it easier for our students to attend college here. And I guess that's about it. I hope you all have, as the greeting goes, a ksiva v'chsima tova. May you be written and sealed for a good new year, and I look forward to speaking to you next week. Take care.